Welcome to The Place We Find Ourselves, the podcast where we not only talk about all things related to story, trauma, and therapy, but also have the privilege of hearing some of the sacred real-life stories of interview guests. My name is Adam Young, and this is episode 2. In today's episode, I talk about your story with your parents, and what a complex and difficult subject this is to think about and to reflect on. But that alone is instructive. Why is it that we all have a hard time taking an honest look at how our parents treated us, at how they related to us? No parent is perfect, and no child needs their parents to be perfect. In fact, a child only needs the parent to get it right about 50% of the time. That's the mark of a good enough caregiver, 50% of the time. Today's podcast looks at the 6 core things you needed from your parents. And this gives birth to a discussion about what happens in your heart if these 6 things are lacking. As we continue to look at story, we need to look at your relationship with your parents. Arguably the most significant part of your story. Certainly the relationship with your parents has had the most shaping influence on your brain and the trajectory of your story. God created human beings as fundamentally relational creatures. We're created in the image of a triune God, a we and not an I. And so we are, at our core, relational beings. And so given the fact that we are relational beings through and through, your relationship with the 2 most important people in your life is going to be rather significant in how you move about in the world. And what I want to start with is looking at the relational needs that every single child has when they come into this world. Every child has 6 core relational needs, 6 things that you need or needed from your relationship with your mother, your relationship with your father. And here are those 6 things. Number 1 is attunement. Attunement refers to the degree to which your mother was able to read what was going on inside of your heart, what was going on inside of your body, what was going on inside of your mind, what you were feeling, what you were thinking, what was happening for you internally. Were your parents so attuned to you that they knew what you were feeling when you were growing up? And this doesn't mean that they're mind readers. It doesn't mean that they're clairvoyant. It means, did they notice when your face fell? And did they pursue you with some measure of kind of curiosity about, honey, what's going on for you? Are you okay? A parent that is distracted by their own needs, their own wants, their own emotions, their own personal pain, can't be attuned to their child's needs. Does that describe your mom? Was she too distracted by her own stuff, what was going on inside of her, that it made it very difficult for her to be attuned and concerned with and curious about and attentive to what was going on inside of you? And what about your dad? Was your father attuned to your heart? Was he attuned to the emotional ups and downs that every child experiences as they're growing up? You didn't need your parents to perfectly attune to you. Nobody does. The core of attunement, actually, is not reading you right. The core of attunement is recognizing when the child is feeling unheard or unseen, and then pressing in to try and understand what's happening for the child. It's in the process of misattunement, frankly, and then reattunement that you come to feel safe with your parents, that you come to feel like they are truly there for you. So, were your parents attuned to you? Did your father notice when things were not well inside of you, when you were sad, when you were angry, when you were feeling alone or lonely? Did your father notice that? And did he ask you, honey, what's going on for you? How are you? You seem to be down. And what about your mother? Was your mother attuned to what was happening inside your heart? Number 2, relational need that every kid has is responsiveness. You needed your parents. Every child needs their parents to be responsive when the child is feeling distressed, mad, sad, afraid. When you were feeling distressed, did your parents respond to you? Did they offer comfort, care, kindness? If your parents read your face, how did they respond to what they read? If they read your nonverbal communication well, if they attuned to you, how did they respond once they were clued in to what was going on for you? Some of you actually want to believe that your parents were not attuned to you, because if they were, if they knew when you were hurting, then it means that they didn't care that you were hurting. They didn't respond to your hurt. Again, what mattered to you as a child was not that your parents got it right each time, but that they recognized when they missed you or hurt you and responded in a way that brought comfort and that brought reconnection. As a 7-year-old girl, you needed your mother to be responsive to your heart when it was in need. As a 9-year-old boy, you needed your father to respond to you when things were not well in your heart. So responsiveness is number 2. The third thing that every child needs from their parents is engagement. Did your parents have an internal intention and a genuine desire to truly know you, to know your heart? Were they willing and able to engage with you on a heart level? Were you pursued by your parents? There's a neuroscientist named Kurt Thompson who has said that each one of us comes into this world looking for someone looking for us. We come into this world looking for someone looking for us. Our deepest desire is that there will be someone looking for us, and that this person will always be there for us and will pursue our hearts with a genuine desire to truly know us, to know what's going on inside of us. The core of abandonment is not physical abandonment. It's a lack of attunement, responsiveness, and engagement from your parents. So back to Kurt Thompson, he says this: we can grow up in homes in which the food finds the table, the money finds the college funds, and the family even finds the church each Sunday, but somehow our hearts remain undiscovered by the 2 people we most need to know us, our parents. Did your heart remain undiscovered by your parents? If it did, then that had a big impact on your developing brain. As a relational creature, a relational being, you deeply needed not just attunement, not just responsiveness, but you needed engagement. You needed pursuit of your heart. The 4th need is you needed your parents to be able to regulate your affect. Affect refers to your internal emotional state. It's the felt sense of what's happening inside your body, and it ranges from numb and shut down to terrified and panicked. So whenever you are stressed out, that's another way of saying that your affect is dysregulated. As a child, you had very limited ability to regulate your own affect. And as an infant, you had absolutely no ability to regulate your own affect. An infant is utterly dependent on their mother's ability to regulate their affect for them. In other words, for the mother to soothe and comfort and quiet a dysregulated or distressed or panicked or terrified or hungry or afraid child. So when you were distressed as a child, you needed your mother, you needed your father to soothe you whenever you were anxious or scared, and at the same time, to stimulate you whenever you were shutting down. If your mother was attuned enough to you and willing to respond to you and engage with you, then she was able to effectively regulate your affect. But if she wasn't attuned to you, or if she wasn't willing to respond to you for whatever reason, and if she wasn't willing to engage and pursue your heart when you were distressed, then your affect was not regulated. And as a result, you would have been forced to try and regulate it yourself, which is an impossible task for an infant and a nearly impossible task for a young child. You needed your mother to be able to regulate your affect so that you could, in turn, learn how to regulate it yourself. That's how the brain learns how to do affect regulation. It learns it by having it done for them by mom. So you needed to learn how to calm your own anxiety and bring quiet and calm and groundedness back to a dysregulated body. And likewise, you needed to learn how to spring to life again when you were shutting down or going numb. Core relational need number 5. You needed your parents to be strong enough to handle your negative emotions. Strong enough to handle your negative emotions. Did your parents welcome your anger, your sadness, your fear, the so-called negative emotions? As a child, you needed to be free to express these negative emotions, to cry, to rage, or to fall silent, knowing that you would be responded to in a meaningful way. You needed to know deep down in your gut that your emotions were accepted and allowed. Was that the case for you? Or did you have the sense that your negative emotions were somehow unwelcome? Perhaps your family was too fragile to bear the weight of your unedited soul. You needed to feel the freedom to say, I hate you, or you don't love me, or you're mean, knowing that you wouldn't be met with something like, how can you say that? Or don't you know that hurts mommy's feelings? Or you selfish little boy. You needed to be able to speak and express anger, fear, and sadness without being shamed or told that wasn't appropriate or allowable. My 5-year-old son, Eli, looked me square in the eye one day and angrily said something incredibly disrespectful. I don't remember what he said, but I remember the incident. And here's what I remember most. My bodily experience of it was absolute shock, because I had this sense of, Eli, you have no idea what I could do to you. And I felt that because I never, ever expressed anger at my dad, because I knew he would have exploded on me. I was terrified of him. And so when my son expressed that level of rage and disrespect at me, I was absolutely stunned. Now, on the more humorous side, my 8-year-old daughter was furious at me, and she was at the top of the stairs, I remember, and she looked at me with these really intense eyes, and she screamed, "The rocket ship of not caring about me is blasting off, and you're driving it." That is a wonderful moment for a parent, because you know that your child feels the freedom to express rage at you. Next thing that you needed from your parents was their willingness to repair when there was disconnection. Their willingness to repair, especially when they hurt you. So when your parents hurt you, did they own and rectify the harm that they did? A healthy, trusting attachment it's not built on the absence of failure. All parents fail many, many, many times. A healthy relationship is not built on the absence of failure, but on the willingness of the parent to own and rectify the failures when they do occur. No parent gets it right 100% of the time. Parents get tired, they get distracted, they get frustrated, they get stressed out trying to do 100 things at once. There are times when even the best parents are not attuned or responsive. So the parent-child connection ruptures frequently. No big deal. The mark of a good enough caregiver is that these ruptures are repaired through a process of reattunement and re-engagement with the child. What mattered to you as a kid was not that your parents got it right each time, but that they recognized when they missed you or hurt you, and they responded in a way that brought comfort and that brought reconnection to the relationship. So, summary. In terms of your story with your parents, you needed that story to be marked by attunement, responsiveness, engagement, the ability to regulate your affect, your stressed out self, the willingness to tolerate and to welcome your so-called negative emotions, and the willingness to repair when there was harm done. So as you reflect back on your story as a kid with regard to these 6 categories, how would you write the story of your childhood in terms of these 6 categories? What would you say? What was true? All storytelling is confession. The Greek word for confession in the Bible is the word homologeo, and the word homo meaning sameness, logeo meaning speaking, and so the word confess really means speaking sameness with God about what actually happened, about what was true. Can you be truthful and honest about your childhood with regard to these 6 core relational needs that every child has? Now, another way to think about your story with your parents, besides those 6 categories, another way to think about it is to consider the following 2 kind of relational styles or relational experiences that you had as a boy, as a girl with your parents. And first I'll tell you what the 2 are, then I'll explain them. Number 1 is a story in which you were often dismissed, being dismissed. And then number 2 is a story in which you were often parentified. By parentified, I mean that one of your parents asked you to fill their needs rather than them filling and meeting your needs. Was your story one in which you could write over the story, I was dismissed? Or was it one in which you could write over the story, I was parentified? Now, here's what I mean by each of those. First, being dismissed. The core of being dismissed is that you are not taken seriously, that your emotions especially are not taken seriously and responded to authentically. It's a sense in which you try and express something of emotion to your mother, to your father, and it doesn't land. It doesn't make an impact on them in such a way that prompts them to respond to you in a meaningful, caring, tender way. So what happens inside your heart when the posture of your father or your mother is one of dismissing you? You quickly learn that it is easier to try to regulate your own anxiety than to seek comfort from your mom, who is either physically unavailable or physically present but emotionally unavailable, emotionally unresponsive. And the reasoning goes like this. Mom is either not going to understand me, or worse, she's going to dismiss me. So I guess I'm on my own. And so there's this sense of you have no choice but to go it alone. In fact, your choice to become self-reliant is actually your desperate attempt to avoid further evidence that no one is there for you. The thinking goes like this. If I don't ask for help, then they can't dismiss me. If I don't bring my emotional concerns to my mom, then she can't dismiss me. So since your needs and wants rarely seemed to matter to your father, you stop even trying to express what you need and want. And your core narrative becomes, I am alone and on my own. I don't need you to be there for me. I'm fine whatever you do. You become self-reliant and you develop a view of yourself as independent and strong because, after all, you don't really need anyone. And you grow up and you have a very hard time receiving care from your spouse or from close friends. Why? Because to receive care would connect you to that deep part of your heart that desperately needed care from your parents rather than dismissal. Now, you may be thinking, this sounds kind of true for me, but is it really my parents' fault? I mean, I didn't really make an effort to let my parents in. Really? Let's see. As a therapist, I often hear stories about abuse at the hands of a grandfather or a neighbor or an older kid down the street, abuse by someone other than one's parents. And after a client tells me one of these stories, I often ask the following question. When you told your mom and dad about what happened, how did they respond? It's a very disarming question because 99% of the time, the client looks at me and says, oh, I never would have done that. And I simply ask, why not? And though I would in no way want to minimize the horror of the abuse proper, the thing that crushes the child's soul is more often their parents' refusal to engage the incident of abuse rather than the abuse itself. Do you realize that when you were 3 years old and something bad happened, you ran to your mom for comfort? It is instinctual. You did it. The question is, when did you stop doing that? The only way you develop a sense of, I could never tell my parents, is because you've gone to them before many, many times, only to be dismissed or blamed. So please let go of the conclusion that you didn't make an effort to let your parents in. Now, relational dynamic number 2 refers to being parentified. What happens inside your heart when the posture of your mother or father is not one of dismissal, but is one of taking their emotional needs to you? This can be more confusing than when a parent is dismissive of you, because looking back, you know that there were times when your mother did provide soothing and comfort and care and attention and attunement. There are lots of times when she seems to have, quote unquote, been there for you, and a closeness developed. At some point in everyone's life, you need to draw a triangle. And on that triangle, you need to place your mom, your dad, and you. A healthy family triangle will look like, I believe it's called an isosceles triangle, if I'm remembering geometry correctly. And a isosceles triangle, or at least the triangle I have in my mind's eye, has mom and dad at the top, and the line that connects those two angles, those 2 points, is closer than the bottom point of the triangle, which is you. And you are equidistant from mom and dad. So it's a isosceles triangle, a perfect triangle, I guess you could call it. And the 2 points at the top representing mom and dad are closer, it's a shorter line, than you are to either mom or dad. That's an ideal, healthy, emotional triangle where your mother and father are engaged in a meaningful and substantive and honest relationship with one another. What did your triangle look like? What does your triangle look like? If your triangle doesn't look like the isosceles triangle, then there are 2 things that are true. Number 1, you will know something of being hated, and you will know something of being consumed or used. Here's what I mean. If both parents aren't committed to engaging one another honestly and owning their failures and repairing mistakes and fighting for each other's hearts, then one of the parents will inevitably become closer to one of the children. This is a rule of thumb. If there is a failure with your mother and father in regards to loving one another, there will be what's called triangulation, which is to say that you will be asked to be closer to one of your parents than they are to their spouse. So when there's a failure of attunement between your mother and father, when mom and dad are not in a healthy, intimate, deeply engaged relationship with one another, then they will need to look somewhere for attunement, because people need attunement. And oftentimes, one of the parents will look to a child to meet their emotional needs. So what did your triangle look like? Who was there for your mother, given that your father was not? Who was there for your father, given that your mother was not? Did your mother look to you to be the person that would husband her? And this can apply to daughters as well as sons. The person that would engage with her emotionally, care for her heart, provide containment when she's dysregulated, that would husband her because her husband was unwilling to be a husband. If you were chosen to be that person, then you are in an emotionally incestuous relationship with that parent, and you've become a parentified child. This kind of triangulation puts the child in a horrible bind that provides years of subsequent torment. And here's the bind. Your mother chose you to be her spouse when you were a child and therefore couldn't be a spouse, couldn't be an adult. But your mother trained you and groomed you and chose you over your father to be her spouse because, frankly, you were better at it. And not only was this deeply damaging to your heart, but on top of it, it made your father hate you because he wasn't particularly fond of you being closer to his wife than he was. And all that applies to a daughter that was in a similar situation. So whenever there's triangulation, one of the parents is always consuming you and the other is always envying and hating you. And these dynamics of triangulation reverberate through the whole family. So let's say you are a daughter and you had two sisters, but you were the one that your father chose instead of his wife to be for him a surrogate spouse. And in the choosing of you, he did not choose your sisters. And therefore you bear something of your sister's envy, but you also bear something of feeling perverse because you wanted dad to choose you over your sisters. Anybody would, even though you knew that relationship, though you didn't have this language, was abusive. And so you feel perverse. So in this relational dynamic of being parentified or of being made to be a surrogate spouse to one of your parents, it looks like this. At times, mom was attuned and responsive to you, but at other times, she was too caught up in her own emotional needs to focus on meeting yours. And so her inconsistency and her uncertainty forced you to become hyper-focused on her. That is, to attune to her emotional state rather than her attuning to yours. In other words, mom's care and comfort came with a condition. You must meet her spousal needs. And this dynamic creates a sense that others cannot be relied upon to meet your needs. And it is a form of abandonment that results in an inner franticness because you never know when the other person is going to be there for you or not. So that is a brief overview of what happens when you are parentified, when you are asked to meet one of your parents' emotional needs. And so there is the category of being dismissed, and then there is this category of being parentified, and these correlate to two forms of attachment, of insecure attachment called, in the case of being dismissed, avoidant attachment, which we'll have another podcast about, and in the case of being made to be a spouse, ambivalent attachment, which we'll have another podcast about. So what has been true for you with regard to your story with your parents? What did your triangle look like? Which of those 6 core needs were met for you, and to what degree, and by which parent? These questions form the contours, the landscape of what is the story of your relationship with arguably the 2 most important people in your world, certainly in terms of how your brain was shaped and how it developed. If you are interested in a document, 2-page document that outlines and describes the 6 core things that every child needs from their parents, I've created one, and you can access it by going to adamyoungcounseling.com/big6. One word, /big6. Thanks so much for listening to The Place We Find Ourselves. Music for this podcast was provided by Rick Wilson. If you would like to subscribe to future episodes, you can go to adamyoungcounseling.com/podcast, and there will be a button to subscribe for future podcast episodes.